The morning sun rose over Maplewood Estates, painting every roof tile in golden light. The street looked like a picture from a real estate brochure. Manicured lawns, white fences, trimmed hedges. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place, and that was exactly how Karen liked it. Karen Myers, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, was already out before most people had even made their coffee. Clipboard in hand, visor on her head, and her signature pink polo tucked neatly into her khaki shorts, she looked every bit the Suburban commander. Her eyes scanned the cul-de-sac like a general inspecting her troops. To her, Maplewood Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was her empire. She frowned at the sight of a small puddle near the curb. Ugly. She muttered under her breath, completely ruins the aesthetic. Her pen clicked twice against the clipboard as she jotted down a note under beautification ideas. 2 maintenance workers, dressed in neon vests, were unloading tools from a truck nearby. They had been hired but a POAs, POV neighborhood appearance, though neither of them quite understood what that meant yet. Karen marched toward them, heels of her sneakers tapping smartly on the pavement. "Gentlemen," she began, her tone sharp and efficient, "we're focusing on the drains today." One of the workers, a burly man named Mike, wiped sweat from his brow. "Yes, ma'am. We were going to clear them out and make sure they're ready for the rainy season. They're a bit clogged up from last month's leaves." Karen's expression soured, as though he'd suggested throwing garbage on her lawn. "No, no, no," she said, waving her clipboard like a traffic wand. "I don't want them cleared. I want them sealed." Mike blinked. "Sealed, yes," she said, snapping her gum. "They're eyesores. These ugly metal grates everywhere. It's not exactly what you'd see in a luxury neighborhood, is it? They collect dirt, trash, leaves. They're disgusting. I want them gone." The other worker, a younger guy named Louise, exchanged a confused glance with Mike. Ma'am, if we seal them, the rainwater won't have anywhere to go." Karen smiled in that way people do when they're not listening, but pretending to. "That's why we have landscaping," she said matter-of-factly. "Proper grass and soil absorb excess water. I read about it online. It's all about natural drainage," Mike sighed. "With all due respect, that's not how it works. These drains are connected to the storm system. They prevent flooding. We can't just—" Karen cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, please. I've lived here 15 years and never once seen a flood. You're talking nonsense. And besides, I'm the HO president. The board has approved this beautification project." She didn't mention that the board consisted of herself and her neighbor, Linda, who usually just nodded and agreed to anything Karen said to avoid confrontation. Louise shrugged, uneasy. "Well, you're the boss." "That's right," she said with satisfaction. "Now I want every drain on this street sealed with concrete. Smooth, clean, uniform. Make it beautiful." As the workers began mixing cement, Karen moved on to her next task, inspecting lawns. She had a keen eye for rule violations: grass taller than 3 inches, unapproved mailbox designs, mismatched paint shades. She scribbled notes furiously. Across the street, a neighbor named Henry stepped out of his house holding a mug of coffee. He was still in his slippers, his hair wild. He squinted at the sight of construction workers filling the storm drains. "What in the world are they doing, Karen?" he called. Karen turned with her trademark tight smile. "Good morning, Henry. Just improving the neighborhood." "The drains were unsightly, don't you think?" Henry frowned. "Unsightly? They're drains. What happens when it rains?" "Please," Karen said dismissively. "You act like we live in a swamp. A little rain never hurt anyone." Henry took a sip of his coffee and shook his head. "You're gonna regret that, Karen." But she was already walking away, humming to herself, clipboard tucked under her arm. Every drain on the block was sealed. Smooth slabs of gray concrete gleamed where dark iron grates used to be. Karen stood admiring the result like an artist viewing her finished painting. "Perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." She called over the workers, who were wiping their hands and packing up tools. "Excellent job, gentlemen. You've made Maplewood Estates a place of real class. I'll make sure the HO gives you both a great review." Mike forced a polite smile, muttering something under his breath as he climbed into the truck. As the rumble of the engine faded, Karen walked back to her driveway. Her immaculate SUV gleamed in the sunlight, and she paused to admire her reflection in the side mirror. Not a hair out of place. Everything in her world was under control. Inside her house, she sat down at her laptop and began drafting an email to all residents of Maplewood Estates. She titled it Neighborhood Beautification Update. New improvements implemented. She typed with flair, her fingers tapping with self-satisfaction. "Dear residents, I'm pleased to announce that our street is looking better than ever. The HOA has completed a major improvement project to enhance our neighborhood's appearance. You'll notice smoother curbs and a cleaner, more polished look throughout Maplewood Estates. Please remember that maintaining our neighborhood's image is a shared responsibility. Ensure your lawns are trimmed, trash cans hidden, and vehicles kept in good condition. Together, we can preserve the beauty that makes this community special. Warm regards, O President. She read it over 3 times, smiling proudly before pressing send. Down the street, a few residents read the email and groaned. Beautification, my foot, muttered Henry, forwarding the message to his wife. She's lost it this time. Others just ignored it. After all, arguing with Karen was like trying to reason with a hurricane. She'd quote HOA bylaws, cite imaginary regulations, and talk circles around anyone who challenged her. By late afternoon, the sky began to darken, a thin veil of gray clouds rolling in, but Karen didn't notice. She was too busy watering her petunias, humming contentedly as droplets sparkled on her freshly sealed curb. When her husband, Rick, came home from work, he noticed the concrete patches right away. Karen, what happened to the drains? He asked, stepping out of his car. Had them sealed, she said proudly. They were such an eyesore. Rick stared at her. You sealed storm drains. What if it rains? Karen waved a hand. Oh, stop worrying. I read about this online. It's called aesthetic storm management. The landscaping handles it. Rick frowned, but after 15 years of marriage, he knew better than to argue. He just sighed, kissed her on the cheek, and went inside. As the first distant rumble of thunder echoed through the clouds, Karen stood at the end of her driveway, hands on hips, admiring the street once more. Perfect. She murmured again. She didn't notice the smell of ozone in the air, or the faint cool wind that carried the scent of rain. To her, everything looked just right, clean, uniform, and under control. For now. The storm began as a whisper, a distant grumble of thunder that most people would have ignored. But by evening, the sky had turned an eerie shade of green, gray, heavy and brooding. The air felt thick, charged with electricity. Wind stirred through Maplewood Estates, rattling wind chimes and bending the rose bushes that lined the driveways. Karen noticed the change only when she went to close her windows. The first drops of rain spattered against the glass, soft at first, then steadier. She frowned, annoyed more than worried. Well, that's inconvenient, she muttered, pulling the curtains closed. Just when everything looked so nice. Across the street, Henry was rolling up his garden hose, watching the clouds roll in with a grim expression. He'd lived in the area for 20 years, and he knew the signs of a bad storm. This one's gonna hit hard, he muttered to himself. His wife Maggie called from inside. You coming in? They said it might flood. Henry shot a glance at the street. The same street where Karen's concrete patches gleamed faintly under the growing rain. He shook his head. Yeah, I'm coming, he said, but his stomach twisted with unease. By the time night fell, the rain was no longer rain. It was a downpour. Sheets of water cascaded from the sky, hammering the roofs, flooding gutters, pounding on the concrete. Thunder rolled so loud it rattled windows. Lightning forked across the horizon, illuminating the neighborhood for split seconds, enough to show the water creeping up the curbs. Inside her living room, Karen sat on the couch with a chamomile tablet. The HOA group chat pinged constantly. Linda. Anyone else's street flooding a little. Tom, lot 90, water's halfway up the sidewalk. The drains aren't working. They're not working because Karen had them sealed. Karen. Oh, don't be dramatic, Henry. It's just heavy rain. She set tablet aside with a scoff. Always overacting, she said aloud to no one. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The rain beat harder, almost deafening now. Outside, the street was beginning to change. The water that had pooled around the curbs was rising, inch by inch, with nowhere to go. It lapped over the sidewalks, then crept toward the driveways. A few neighbors stood at their windows, silhouettes against the lightning flashes. Someone shouted faintly through the storm. It's backing up. By 10 o'clock, the gutters overflowed, and the water was knee-deep in places. The sealed storm drains, invisible under smooth concrete, trapped everything. Leaves, trash, runoff, all swirling in a growing whirlpool that had no escape. Karen finally noticed when her motion sensor light turned on, triggered by the reflection of the water moving across her driveway. She pulled back the curtain, frowning. The street looked wrong, glistening, distorted. She blinked, realizing she couldn't see the pavement anymore. Her jaw tightened. No, that can't be right. She opened the front door, and a gust of cold, wet wind hit her. Rain slapped her face as she stepped onto the porch. The sight made her stomach drop. Water filled the street like a dark river, rippling with every gust. Her mailbox stood half submerged. Her prized flower beds were underwater, and her SUV, her gleaming, spotless pride, sat in the driveway with water already touching its tires. From next door, Henry's voice shouted over the storm, Karen, the drains. The water's not going anywhere. Karen's heart thudded. She shook her head, shouting back. It's just temporary. It'll drain soon. But it didn't. It rose higher. The rain seemed relentless. Pounding of the sky itself was furious. Lightning flashed again, and Karen saw other neighbors rushing outside with flashlights, some moving their cars, others trying to clear debris with rakes. But the water was already too deep. Within another 20 minutes, it reached halfway up the wheels of her SUV. She ran to it, clutching her umbrella, rainwater soaking her shoes. She yanked the door open and tried to start the engine. It sputtered, then died. The water surged higher, swirling around her ankles. "Come on, come on," she shouted, pounding the steering wheel. Across the street, Henry was helping Maggie carry bags upstairs. He looked out and saw Ken waist-high water, screaming at her car. He felt a mix of frustration and pity. "She did this," he muttered. "She really did this." Karen stumbled out of the car as another flash of lightning lit the street. The SUV shifted slightly, lifted by the current. "No, no, no," she screamed, trying to hold onto the side mirror. But the force of the water knocked her back. The car drifted slowly down the street, headlights flickering like dying candles. She stood there, frozen, watching it float away, helpless. All around, alarms started blare. Other cars, half submerged, their electronics shorting out in the flood. The sound was eerie, a chorus of distress echoing through the night. Neighbors to each other, voices panicked. Someone yelled, "Turn off the power." Another shouted, "The basement's flooding." Karen stumbled back to her porch, shivering, soaked through, her visor gone, hair plastered to her face. She could taste the grit of rainwater on her lips. When she looked down the street, she saw toys, trash cans, and flower pots drifting past. And then, heartbreakingly, her brand new Sue bumping into a lamppost before floating farther away. By midnight, Maplewood Estates looked like a lake. The water reached the bottom steps of several homes. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, but the rain continued without mercy. Inside, Karen wrapped herself in a blanket, sitting by the window in silence. Her tablet buzzed again. "Linda, Karen, what do we do? The whole street's underwater. Tom, my basement's destroyed. Henry, next door project unsealed the drains." Karen stared at the screen. Her throat felt tight. For the first time, she didn't have a reply. She didn't have a plan, a bylaw, or a quick justification. Just the sound of the storm outside and the sinking realization that all of it was her doing. Hours passed before the rain finally began to ease. The thunder moved farther away, a low growl fading into the distance. The water, though, remained, still and black under the flickering streetlights. When dawn came, Maplewood Estates looked unrecognizable. Cars rested sideways on lawns. Mud streaked the sides of houses. The sidewalks were littered with debris. And at the end of the street, Karen's SUV was wedged against a fence, half submerged in a pool of brown water. Neighbors emerged slowly, shell-shocked and silent. No one spoke to her at first, though several gave her looks sharp enough to cut glass. Henry walked by, rain boots squelching in the mud, and paused just long enough to meet her eyes. "Told you," he said quietly. Karen didn't answer. She stood on her porch in her soaked robe, staring out at what used to be her perfect street, her masterpiece. Every car, every lawn, every driveway ruined. For once she had nothing to say, no rule to cite, no excuse to make. Just the dull ache of watching everything she'd tried to control fall apart. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline. A frog croaked somewhere near the flooded playground. Karen looked down at her clipboard, still sitting on the porch where she dropped it the night before. The pages were soaked and curling, her neat notes running together into unreadable gray lines. She picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then let it slip from her fingers back into the muddy water. When the tow trucks arrived later that morning, she didn't even step outside. She just watched through the window as they pulled away her SUV, water streaming from its doors, and listened to the hollow silence left behind. The Queen of Maplewood Estates had finally lost her kingdom, not a rebellion, but to reign.